Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the 8th session of Book Reviews with myself, Usaama al-Azami, and Dr. Omar Anchassi. This is a show where I interview Dr. Omar Anchassi about books that he's been reading lately. And this week we're going to be having a look at Sohaira Siddiqui's book, Law and Politics Under the Abbasids, an intellectual portrait of al-Juwayni.
I still hold it up to the camera just so people
please.
can see.
I'll hold this up. And so we have a standard format whereby we basically Omar will present on the book for 10 to 15 minutes. I'll have a discussion with him for 15 to 30 minutes, and then we open the floor for Q&A. And inshallah, if anyone has any questions, you can write them in your chat, whether you're coming from Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. I think Facebook and Twitter actually is where you would be able to write in the chat. And inshallah, we will get back to you in the last 15 to 20 minutes of this session. So we welcome Q&A questions, and we welcome feedback. And please remember to like, follow, or subscribe if you want to get regular notifications of this event. So without further ado, Omar, would you like to take it away, inshallah?
Sure, and I should point out that we are looking to improve the sound quality of this series of discussions, and Usaama and I are investing some time into exploring how that can be done, because we do intend to make them available in the form of podcasts as well.
Absolutely.
But to get that out of the way, Sohaira Siddiqui's book, An Intellectual Portrait of al-Juwayni, Usaama and I were discussing it not many minutes ago, and independently of each other, we came to describe this book using the same word, which is serious. And that is not to say that any of the books we've discussed, yes, serious scholarship, and not to say that any of the books we've discussed before do not also possess the quality of seriousness. But this one is really not bedtime reading. The amount of time clearly the author has invested in the reading of very technically demanding works in genres like Usul al-Fiqh, Islamic legal theory, and in particularly abstruse domains of Islamic theology, epistemology, and so on, really shows in this book. And as such, it's one that you read and you're immediately impressed by the erudition on display, and you have to really, to truly digest the content, you have to revisit it, and as I did the second time, I made thorough notes and so on. It's very tautly structured, so I'll give you a brief idea of what the book contains. It breaks down into 4 sections. The first section contains 2 chapters on the historical background, Juwayni's context, his life, his intellectual career, and so on. The second section explores epistemology, so focusing in particular on what Juwayni has to say about knowledge, especially in his theological writings. And the middle section of the book, which is by far the largest, containing 4 chapters, explores his legal theory. So you have a chapter on tawatur, ijma', and 2 kinds of qiyas. So a chapter on qiyas al-ma'na, chapter on qiyas al-shabah, and the final 2 chapters explore his political thought, and in particular his extremely fascinating book, Ghiyath al-Umam, or for short, the Ghiyathi, which is a term he himself uses. Now, what are the key features of Dr. Siddiqui's argument? She is making the point, and she's making a number of major, I think, contributions, of course, to the study of Juwayni, but also to Islamic intellectual history more broadly. She's arguing that Juwayni has an intellectual project, which is not a straightforward assertion. It's something that has to be demonstrated, and I think she demonstrates it very well. What is Juwayni's major intellectual project? It's all to do with 2 key themes: certainty in terms of knowledge in particular, and continuity. Continuity in terms of religious knowledge and religion and social life and so on. And throughout the book, she explores the interplay, the sort of dialectical relationship between certainty and continuity in different domains of Juwayni's thought. So focusing on Juwayni's theology, his legal theory, and finally his politics. And she shows that in each domain of his thought, there is a slightly different relationship between these 2. In some areas, in particular when discussing Islamic theology and the epistemology underlying this. He clearly privileges certainty over continuity. In some domains of the law, particularly when discussing qiyas, he privileges continuity over certainty. You cannot have certainty in all areas of Islamic law, something I'll kind of discuss in a bit. And he's willing to sacrifice that for continuity. And then finally, all three of these, the certainty continuity dialectic emerges very strongly, and its relationship with community in the final two chapters on Juwayni's politics, where he envisions, towards the end of the book, what really happens in the absence of the Imam, and then finally what happens in the event that Mufti Mujtahids disappear, and then even jurists of any kind disappear, and knowledge of the Sharia gradually dissipates, and so on. So there are a lot of things going on in this book, and as we always say in every episode, we cannot do justice to it. But the structure is extremely taut, and although we should concede that some chapters, in particular those on epistemology, and I think the chapters on qiyas in particular, are often very technically involved, and I think this is the nature of the discourse. It goes with the territory. You cannot discuss Islamic legal theory without getting into these points of details, and moreover, the author would not be able to make an argument about Juwayni's intellectual project, I think, without entering into these details. But nonetheless, she clearly signposts the key argument, so you can always follow at least the main points of the argument. Now, she's also making a broader methodological intervention, which is, I think, a point that deserves attention among Islamicists. Often we read fantastic monographs on, the theology of a particular figure, or legal theory as a discipline in its history. She calls on the readers to take to read Juwayni across genres, to take seriously the challenge of interdisciplinarity in the kind of Islamic context. Juwayni had many hats. He wrote influentially in domains like legal theory and theology and so on. And yet he was a coherent thinker. And in order to make this point, she has to demonstrate these intellectual threads exist throughout the project. So he was one man with an intellectual project, and much of the book is interested in kind of excavating exactly what this is. So there is a great discussion of his biography and his context, and Siddiqui does an excellent, or I should say Sohaira, since we know her, both of us personally. Sohaira does a wonderful job of tying these concerns, particularly the twin pillars of certainty and continuity, to Juwayni's context. He is deeply shaped, and his intellectual agenda very deeply bears the impress of his context. In the Nishapur, where Juwayni lived, there was, before his lifetime and into his lifetime, constant vying, constant struggle and contestation, not only on the political but on the religious plane. There was political tension and a kind of working relationship, if you like, emerged between the Seljuk sultans and the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad, and at times it was a tense relationship. And there was also constant contestation, religiously speaking, along two axes: theologically, in the region between the Ash'ara and the Mu'tazila, and legally between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is. And in various ways, Juwayni's intellectual project is tied to these contextual concerns, but they shape the environment he grows up in, and so on, in a variety of ways. Now, there is much to say, but where to kind of begin? I could say something about his biography or theology or legal theory, anyway, and so on.
We could go into the discussion, and in the course of the discussion we can...
Yes, sure. I think that would be a helpful way to do it. Yes.
Perfect.
But I should say, we all kind of know in the back of our minds, those of us who kind of know about Islamic legal theory and Islamic theology, that Juwayni is a major influence. He's usually overshadowed, which is an unfortunate position to be in, by his stellar pupil al-Ghazali, Hujjat al-Islam. so to speak. But I think one of the many important contributions the book makes is highlighting really the pervasive influence of Juwayni. I mean, not all of his arguments were positively received by posterity. So, for instance, drawing on the work of Wisnowski and Griffel and others, Juwayni is the first kind of Ash'ari mutakallim, at least that was influential, to take seriously the challenge of Avicennan philosophy. And he already internalized the terminology of, wajib al-wujud, mumkin al-wujud, and this sort of thing. So he laid the groundwork for, you could say, classical Ash'arism, a process that continues with al-Ghazali and really reaches its apex with Razi of engaging with, productively and also negatively with Avicennan philosophy. And this is really what Islamic theology ends up looking like for most of the subsequent period, all the way down to modernity. His arguments aren't always positively received, so he makes a number of innovative contributions, again, in line with this dialectic between continuity and certainty in the domain of legal theory. When it comes for instance, to the issue of ijma', he rejects somewhat iconoclastically the scriptural basis for ijma'. So he says that the scriptural arguments are either, in the case of the Quran, vague, the indicants are too vague to interpret with any certainty, or in the case of hadith, not sufficiently well transmitted, in order for the Quran and the hadith corpus to serve as sufficient evidence of the authority of ijma'. Now, he ultimately accepts that ijma' is an authoritative source in law, but he does this via original means. And many of his commentators and subsequent Ash'ari, Shafi'i legal theorists are not very happy with how he does this, but it's a highly original argument. And I think one of the main maneuvers Sohaira makes in the book is in terms of epistemology. Epistemology really being, the key linchpin, the key thing relating the disciplines of, and tying the disciplines of theology and legal theory together. So she, and clearly again, the relationship between certainty and continuity is all important here. How does Juwayni depart from his Ash'arite predecessors in particular? The one who exercised the most influence on him, of course, being al-Baqillani, something she demonstrates at length. So she discusses Baqillani at some length in the third chapter, particularly his legal theory, also his theology. Juwayni, and you can almost summarize at least those sections of the book with these statements. For Juwayni, all knowledge, once it has been attained, possesses this quality of certainty. You can distinguish certain knowledge, in terms of how it was acquired, and in terms of the cognitive capacities of the reasoner who has reached these conclusions. But ultimately, all knowledge, once it is attained, is certain knowledge, and it is of one kind. She cites Juwayni as saying something along the lines of, there is no knowledge more evident than another kind of knowledge. Abyan, min another ilm, presumably, something like this. And the key binary in al-Juwayni, unlike other legal theorists, even later legal theorists and theologians, is not between knowledge that is necessary, daruri, and knowledge that is acquired or speculative, nadari or kasbi. It is between knowledge that is necessary, that is acquired, and knowledge that is necessary just on its own. So what does that mean? The knowledge yielded by mutawatir hadith is not necessary, which is contrary to the arguments of many legal theorists, but it is necessary, it is kasbi, but necessary, if that makes sense. So all knowledge is certain once it is attained, and not only once it is kind of acquired, it has the same quality in some sense, although you can distinguish, of course, different kinds of knowledge through methods of acquisition. Another important point she makes is Juwayni expands the realm of certainty, and he expands the realm of certainty so to a much greater degree than his Ash'arite predecessors. And how does he do this? One of the key means is by saying that certain knowledge can be obtained not only through exhaustive reason, nadar, and so on, but also through repetition and custom. Juwayni gives the example of a blacksmith. Sohaira gives the kind of more modern example of an experienced driver. You know, when you're learning to drive, which I did many years ago, completely forgotten, to be honest with you. When you're learning to drive, and it's a wonderful example, you know, you start out and you're kind of awkward and you're not sure how often to check in your mirror, and you end up stalling the engine if you're driving not an automatic transmission, it's manual. But you know, over time you get more experienced, and if you've been driving for 40 years, you hardly have to think about any of these things anymore. Even among those who may not have very sophisticated rational capacities, this amounts to certain knowledge. We can also think of the example, I was pondering over the book this morning, of a cook. And we're both very experienced cooks, of course, at least not, well, it's something of an indoor. But any experienced cook, not to perpetuate this gender stereotype, but I'm sure our mothers, and certainly my own, will never have to consult a recipe book, or will never have to measure out ingredients precisely, because through experience and repetition in particular, these things become second nature. It's a kind of certain knowledge. Now, certain knowledge does not obtain across different fields. She discusses Aaron Zeissau's distinction, very important in the domain of legal theory. Zeissau argues it's key, between formalists and materialists. Formalists being, for example, the Ash'ari Shafi'i theoreticians who would say that the sources and the kind of procedure of law has to be certain, but something less than certainty is perfectly fine in the actual furu' of law. Unlike materialists who insist that not only the sources and the procedure of law and lawmaking require absolute certainty, but also the results yielded. Juwayni kind of complicates and problematizes this distinction between formalists and materialists, because he extends the domain of certainty by virtue of this idea of repetition and custom and so on. He's able, in some sense at least, to say that legal conclusions can also be certain. And in what sense does he mean this? So, certainly the sources of law, whether mutawatir, hadith, and so on, can yield certainty. But even when it comes to domains like qiyas and the even less certain form of qiyas al-shaba, which many jurists reject as probative, if one observes the correct procedures and reasons correctly, its results are subjectively at least certain, even though ontologically they might not possess certainty. And Juwayni is one of these legal theorists who believes that there is always one ontologically correct solution to a legal question, and even if jurists do not obtain it. So subjectively there is a kind of can be certain knowledge, even if ontologically that knowledge is not certain. And this interplay and my final point. Yeah.
Sure. Just as a sort of, it's probably useful for a lot of viewers who won't be specialists in legal theory in the Islamic tradition to maybe identify some of these, talking about the mukhati'ah or the musawwibah. So Juwayni falls under the category of the mukhati'ah, from what it seems, and the notion that, sorry, you were talking earlier about. Just a point, but I was just thinking that you should give an example of qiyas al-shabah, because people will not know the difference between qiyas, for example.
Fantastic. So, and this is something I've looked at myself, so I learned a lot, especially from all of the book, but that section was especially fascinating. Qiyas al-shabah is one kind of analogy, unlike qiyas al-ma'na. Qiyas al-shabah is based on some kind of resemblance between two cases, but it is an especially vague kind of resemblance. It is not, unlike qiyas al-ma'na, it is not based on a shared property, I want to say, or a shared illah, a shared kind of legal cause, but it is based on a certain shared feature. So the example Juwayni and Baqillani before him give is, and Sohaira says, some theoreticians give this example actually to show how shaky qiyas al-shabah is as a method of deriving law, the question of slaves' ownership of property. So, different jurists have different opinions on whether slaves own property or not. And she says, I'm not endorsing slavery. It's just an example jurists use to illustrate this point. So some jurists will say that slaves are more like property than human beings. Others will say the opposite. They're more like human beings than they are like property. And this impacts what position you take on this question. Now, somebody who's critical of the idea of qiyas al-shab, so if they're more like humans than property, then they can own property. If they're more like property than humans, they can't own property. Anyway, different views on this, and I think there's a discussion of this point in Jack Brown's book as well, without appealing to these specific examples as far as I remember. Now, this is not a surefire way of deriving Islamic law. And remember, Juwayni is always concerned with certainty and continuity. Why is it not sure? Because one can plausibly make either argument, and it's not really clear which enjoys property prevalence over the other. The Shafi'i view, by the way, is that they're more like property than human beings, and therefore cannot own property. But anyway, so this is not very certain. Now, what happens in domains of the law, particularly qiyas? Now, most Sunni jurists will affirm that qiyas is an authoritative source of Islamic law, but you cannot really, because it is kind of, sometimes has a very tenuous nature with relationship, with the textual sources, or tangential relationship with the textual sources, because you're using a kind of reasoning to extend cases not directly addressed by either the Quran or the Hadith corpus. Juwayni, in some sense, sacrifices the need for certainty to the need for continuity. What do I mean by this? Juwayni, like Ash'arite legal theorists, adopts or defends what Sohaira calls scriptural universalism, which is that scripture addresses all situations are in some sense addressed by scripture, and you need some means of extending the scripture in order to do so. I should say there is an important discussion in the chapters on epistemology, particularly the third chapter of the book, on moral objectivism, or as she argues is the more correct term, the Mu'tazilites had a view which could be described as moral realism versus the, if you like, divine command ethics, or she says the scriptural universalism versus the moral universalism of the Mu'tazila anyway. And that has important implications for the relationship in Islamic legal theory terms between reason and revelation on a range of issues. So a number of the discussions are technically demanding, that's true.
Sorry, I'm just a little conscious of, so obviously this is a very wide-ranging book. It's going to, to be able to do justice to it, we will need to have several sessions, several hours, but we also ought to give do a little bit of justice to our listeners, in giving them, a format that is somewhat more digestible. I think you've covered, in a sense, you've given us an overview of the book, and then you've kind of focused in on chapters which I've not yet had a chance to read. I actually had a read of the introduction and went straight to chapter 9 after that, and then I've had a lot of teaching to do today, so I can get on to chapter 10. Those are areas which are of my own sort of personal interest, since in the realm of politics. But you're, I think, focusing on chapters 3 and 4, which are on epistemology and
yes, and we've discussed chapter 6 a bit as well on and the chapters on qiyas. But yes,
and I think one of the things that is worth highlighting here is this is a very wide-ranging work. I mean, the interdisciplinarity of Sohaira's sort of endeavor is not just impressive, but also it is that, most certainly, but it's also something which is, in a sense, a challenge to scholarship, that we need to adopt this broad, wide-ranging approach in order to do justice to a polymath of this nature. And what I would like to encourage sort of listeners and viewers to also think about is, if you have any particular questions that address certain dimensions of this, whether it's in epistemology, whether it's in legal theory, whether it's in questions of because she's also a very good historian of the period,
Oh, yes.
and portraying sort of
Absolutely.
the context within which he's residing, the sorts of personal relationships he would have had, and the political sort of like.
We should probably address that a bit, because then that's also a very interesting dimension of the book.
I mean, in a sense, the political risks he himself faced as a prominent Shafi'i in a context where the Hanafis were sort of, you know, in some sense a threat, which is that intra-sectarian, it's not sectarian, but intra-madhab sort of like dynamic, which no longer really exists in our time.
But, you know, sociologically speaking, even if the madhab aren't sects, literally, sociologically speaking, it's a kind of sectarianism. This was the environment in which he lived. So, you know, the Ash'aris, the Shafi'is, and there's a close relationship in this period between the Ash'aris and Shafi'is, and even kind of forms of Sufism as well. You know, Shafi'i's intellectual project, she underlines this very clearly, is a product of this intensely competitive context fraught with all kinds of sectarian rivalry, sectarian in the sense we just used.
Yeah, the sociological
and
sense, right.
What happens? You know,
it would be interesting for you to define it briefly, because I mean, we can
illustrate it by talking about the history. So what happens in Nishapur? So, you know, in the 4th century already, you have a major Ash'arite Shafi'i presence in Nishapur. The generation of al-Ash'ari's students kind of migrate there. She talks about the big 3 plus 1, if you like. So the big 3 being the generation of al-Ash'ari students, Ibn Furak, al-Baqillani, and also al-Isfaraini. And in addition, the other one of the next generation, really, Abd al-Qahir al-Baghdadi. These are, you know, Nishapuri, of course, they spend time in different places. Baqillani starts off in Basra and then Baghdad. Actually, he dies in Baghdad, he doesn't go to Nishapur. But the Ash'aris have already a strong presence in Nishapur, and this is where Juwayni's life is lived. I mean, he spends nearly 3 decades, the last 3 decades or so of his life, as the head of this Nizamiya Madrasa established by the vizier of the Seljuks, Nizam al-Mulk. You know, he's an academic in some sense, and we feel a sort of kinship with ulama of this period. But in many ways, his academic life was more colorful than our own. So what happens? The Ghaznavids, the kind of dynasty ruling, or the regime ruling prior to the Seljuks, favors the Hanafis, and this continues into the early Seljuk period. So the Seljuks are kind of contesting and fighting with the Ghaznavids. Eventually they enter Nishapur. And in fact, the Shafi'i jurists of the city are instrumental in negotiating the surrender of the city to the Seljuks.
Right.
No dice, however, because the Seljuks continue to cultivate and to patronize the Hanafis early on. And in fact, beginning in the year 440 of the Hijrah, the Seljuk Sultan Tughril Beg has the Ash'arites, among other sects, and al-Ash'ari himself denounced from the pulpits. And, you know, Hanafi preachers are appointed and so on. And in the momentous year of 446, al-Juwayni, along with 3 other Ash'ari Shafi'i figures, including the famous al-Qushayri, are in fact, you could say, an arrest warrant goes out, or like an Interpol blue notice, or whatever it's red notice. Right. And al-Juwayni, fortunately, has already escaped the city. After a brief stay in Baghdad, he spends 4 years or so in the Hijaz, where he acquires his sobriquet Imam al-Haramain, the Imam of the 2 sanctuaries. And she suggests, because there are conflicting accounts as always, that the real reason he got away was not he was going to seek knowledge, and then he was kind of this arrest decision was issued. No, he knew things were getting hot, so he kind of escaped before they got really bad. He's eventually invited back by Nizam al-Mulk, it seems, to head up the Nizamiya in Nishapur, and that's where he spends the rest of his career. That's where he writes his most influential work. Sohaira tells us the chronology of many of his works is uncertain, but some of the key ones, like Al-Burhan, his work, his magnum opus when it comes to Usul al-Fiqh, is a product of this later period. I should say she focuses mainly on 5 texts, although she draws in many others as well. In theology, she looks at his Irshad and his Shamil fi Usul al-Din, which is incomplete, but there are many commentaries she draws on, and abridgments and things like this. In his legal theory, she draws on al-Burhan and al-Talkhis in particular. Again, she brings in other texts. And finally, on his politics. And depending on our own interests, some people, I know, Usaama, you're very into politics. His politics is very, very, very interesting and highly original. She uses his Ghiyathi, aka Ghiyath al-Umam. Yes, and deeply relevant. And I think in the conclusion, she kind of does reflect on, we as modern Muslims today should really kind of think about, if not the details necessarily, the details of epistemology may not preoccupy us in quite the same way, but certainly that political dimension of this project, I think, is very, very, very relevant and interesting. Right. And I know, Usaama, you're kind of very interested in this dimension of Juwayni.
I am, but I don't want to necessarily hijack the discussion in that direction per se. And I'd like to remind viewers, if anyone does have any particular questions with respect to Juwayni,
or indeed comments, of course.
Or if you want to sort of comment, if you've read the book and you have your thoughts, please feel free. And yes, I think, with respect to the politics side of things, if you can indulge me for a moment, what's really striking is this. Patricia Kroner describes the book al-Ghiyathi or Ghiyath al-Umam 'inda iltiyath al-Dhulam as a kind of what to do in a state of emergency kind of thing. It's a and not in a Schmittian sense, but in a sort of, which is a bit sort of state-centric and about what how the state can, in a sense, take control in moments of emergency or exception. But this is a different kind of exception, which is, what if there is no properly constituted imama, and we just don't have the resources to bring that about anymore? And that really speaks to Muslims today.
Yes.
It's not. I'm not aware, and perhaps this is my own limited reading, and perhaps Sohaira discusses other people who've done similar things. But as far as I know, it's almost exceptional as a project within Sunnism. Obviously, the Shi'i sort of, and perhaps he's even being inspired to a certain extent by Imamis. Obviously, the Fatimiyya are a different sort of fish, but for the Imamis, by this point, they're in a similar kind of situation.
But with, of course, a difference. The Imam the major occultation has occurred, and how 12 understand the Imamate is, of course, somewhat distinct. Now, if I could make this point, because it really, sure, I think, speaks to what you're saying. So you do have before Juwayni, although I think it's the level of the discourse is kind of more sophisticated with him. You do have a discourse, and she alludes to Ahmed Atif Ahmed's book on Futur Sharia, the idea of the fatigue of the Sharia. But Juwayni's discussion of the Imamate, I would say, is, again, this may reflect my limited reading, but does seem to be somewhat unique. And the importance of these kinds of thought experiments to politics and political thinking, I think, is understated. In the Western tradition, you have the idea of the state of nature as a kind of way of explaining and exploring and justifying, political, the constitution of politics and of rule.
I think, they are very different traditions in the sense that, and Andrew March speaks about this in his sort of recent fascinating book as well, The Caliphate of Man, where he basically says that there is this ever-present ummah, which is, in a sense, exists prior to the constituting of a political entity. So, he portrays it as an advantage over the. I seem to have a bit of an echo. Apologize.
Yes.
Let me just mute and unmute myself.
I should say this is very true. Yeah. And in this part of the book, she does riff off, I think, a major kind of argument made by Omar Anchassi, linking epistemology to politics. Right. And how is Juwayni's political project, if you like, linked to his broader intellectual oeuvre? It is the idea that if you cannot have again, this interplay of continuity and certainty. The community is key in politics, and the community is in some sense constituted by the presence of epistemically certain knowledge. So when you don't have an imam, what do you have? You have Sharia knowledge, even if you don't have jurists. You have, in the worst case scenario, one of the worst case scenarios where, all the muftis and even the, semi-competent fuqaha have passed away. You at least have knowledge of basic things like the basic structure of prayer, even if the details and how to perform the prostration of forgetfulness
this is in chapter 10.
Forgotten. Yes, although I'm not a mathematician, anyway.
This is one of the things. As I say, I had a very busy sort of teaching day today, and so I haven't gotten around to that particular chapter. But what I found interesting in chapter 9, which is kind of obviously the preliminary discussion of the politics of emergency, and hasn't gotten to the point where it's absolute desperation, there's not even knowledge that's accessible, is that I found that chapter really speak to our condition, because it's not like chapter 10, which is really the desperate situation, and he's in a sense asking, what's left? What can we know without access to anything?
Yes, and I should say there reaches a point where these, I think she calls them al-umur al-kulli or something like this, these kind of real fundamentals of the Sharia that we know by virtue of repetition, things like prayer. So he says, it may be that regular Muslims in this situation where, people have forgotten or don't have access to jurists and religious professionals, they'll kind of know the basics of prayer, but they may forget certain details like how to perform this. Now, there reaches a point where, he even envisions a situation, and this is, the most radical case, where knowledge of even these basic fundaments of the Sharia is lost. And he says, in this context, there is no more taklif. You are effectively an Ahl al-Fatra, this people of the, who, as if they live between the arrival of prophets and they do not have access to knowledge. Now, because he's an Ash'ari, unlike the Mu'tazila, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. So because this information about revelation and what to do does not reach them, they are not culpable. The Mu'tazila would say differently.
And of course the Maturidis as well, because Abu Hanifa and Al-Alim al-Muta'allim sort of points out that, well, you still need to believe in God, or Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, so on. But what's interesting is that, that's a fascinating sort of statement, and you have a sense of this in his student, in the Faisal al-Tafriqa of al-Ghazali, that people who don't have access to it, they're Ahl al-Fatra. So it's great to know the genealogy of that thought, in a sense, could be from the Ghiyathi, in a sense.
Yeah, elements of it will go even further back. But Usaama, I want to return to this point you were making about speaking to our situation, because we do want to speak to our viewers, and I know Sohaira wants to also speak to her readers in a kind of deeply topical sense.
And,
so you were saying,
I also want to say that I have every intention of actually reading this book, because it is so sort of like relevant to our situation. Yeah. But yes, sorry, you were saying.
Yes, so you said it speaks to our situation because you have this hadith about whoever dies without giving, swearing allegiance to an imam dies the death of jahiliyyah, mitat al-jahiliyyah.
Right.
Where does that leave us? Now, it did remind me of one context, another book I was reading quite recently. So he talks about a situation where you have mufti mujtahid. She uses the term because in legal theory in this period, you can't be a mufti without being a mujtahid,
of course,
as halaq kind of demonstrates.
Right.
So in the absence of an imam, where you cannot even find one person who possesses any of the qualities of the imamate, and I should stress, Ghazali is not formalistic about the imamate. So yes, he discusses the criteria, the qualities and traits an ideal caliph should possess, like all the other theologians before him. But again, he's quite hard-nosed about, what do we really want with imamate? This is something that distinguishes really some Sunni, not all, but certainly some Sunni theologians from 12 the Shia, a point made by Ibn Taymiyyah as well. What's, on the very basic level, what quality must an imam possess? He's willing to forego, in the sake of continuity, right? He's willing to forego all of these requirements and knowledge and ijtihad and lineage and all of these for the sake of preserving the continuity and integrity of the community. What one key quality is he, not really willing to forsake if it's obtainable. And this is shawka, yes, and he refers to it with various terms, but also kifaya, so ability to kind of rule independently and actually possessing force.
Right.
Without this, there can be no rule. This is Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of the 12 theory of imamate. Right. If you do not have an imam who's actually ruling, this is not an imamate. Anyway, it's a critique that we even saw with the text attributed to Abu Ali al-Jubayni. He makes the same point, effectively. Now,
right.
in the Maqalat. Now, this is even reflected when he discusses the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, the people who elect the imam. And he says, unlike many other theories, it's sufficient to have only one elector as long as he's kind of able to influence others. He appeals to the example of Umar ibn al-Khattab, but again, it's a matter of practicality. And, this is in some sense a reflection of what he really saw in his life, where the authority and power of the Abbasid caliphs did not extend, well, certainly not outside of Baghdad, but not really outside of their palace walls in some periods.
Right.
And the Seljuks, the sultans, were the real holders of shawka, and they had kafaya and so on.
Interestingly, I recall Kroner saying in God's Rule, or the sort of British version is Medieval Islamic Political Thought, Edinburgh University Press, 2004, that in a sense, part of Juwayni's message seems to have been to someone like Nizam al-Mulk, can you just basically take over the caliphate altogether? You don't need to. She suggests, he doesn't really take him up on that one. But
now this is really interesting because I've thought about it a lot. I should say, before I make this remark,
sure.
This book introduced, and again, I'm always embarrassed when I say this. There are many sources in the secondary literature I wasn't aware of that Sohaira mentions in this book, like many, not just a small number. I know Sam and I were saying before the session, the book puts us both to shame because Sohaira is also a young scholar and is already deep into the writing of her second book. But anyway. Not to detain you with this point, but one book I think she could have benefited from and doesn't cite is Omid Safi's first book, The Politics of Knowledge in Pre-Modern Islam. He has a very interesting, among many other things he has a very interesting discussion of the relationship between the Seljuks and the Abbasids. And one thing I remember standing with my hair on end, effectively, when I first read it in his book many years ago. The early Seljuks, like Tughril Beg, considered doing away with the Abbasid caliphate entirely. And she does discuss the marriage of Tughril Beg to the caliph's daughter, and Omid Safi has an interesting discussion of this as well. But so, what do we see in Juwayni's lifetime? And throughout his career and before his career, shortly before his career, the basics of communal life are in some sense being threatened. The continuity of the caliphate, the kind of integrity and consensus of the community is riven by this sort of sectarian tension. That really kind of Juwayni is in some sense, he's a refugee. He's a victim of this sectarianism, at least in some part of his life.
Right.
So these kind of concerns he really brings to bear, and they're very much entrenched in his intellectual project. But for Juwayni, continuity is key, and he says, and Omar Anchassi has also discussed Ghazali's political thought. And Ghazali has this famous passage where he talks about living. He really reflects on the absolute necessity of the caliphate. Yes. The absolute necessity of the caliphate. Exactly. So living without a caliph is effectively like eating carrion, or something like this.
I was just actually having a discussion with Andrew March about this yesterday, and I happen to have my very poor copy of Al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad.
Yeah.
So now the interesting. I was reading that section yesterday.
Yes. So how does Juwayni? I think Juwayni, perhaps even more kind of starkly than Ghazali. He knows what's at stake in this discussion. It's not a kind of armchair intellectual exercise. He knows what's at stake.
Ghazali was also potentially threatened.
Of course, and they are. They do overlap, and he's a student after all.
Yeah.
Juwayni says, "What is the purpose of the imamate?" And I think it's a question worth reflecting on. Whichever branch of Islam or whichever view you hold on this.
Right, right.
The purpose of the imamate, the fundamental point about the imamate is to guarantee the flourishing of religion.
Right.
It just so happens that preserving religion and ensuring its continuity and flourishing and prosperity requires, oversight in worldly matters. A good caliph will, ensure the continuity and the flourishing of religion. When he says by kind of watching over these worldly things, he doesn't lose sight of the fundamental aim of the caliphate.
Society exists and runs
Yes.
in order for there to be religion in the first place.
Absolutely, and you can even say that there's this kind of intertwining of religion and politics you find even in the Sasanian political tradition as well. The idea of religion and politics as twin brothers. Right. Or think of
and it's fascinating because I think that's literally quoted in the Ihya Ulum al-Din as well. So it's something which is entirely incorporated.
Yes.
Sultan, Din was Sultan to Aman or something along those lines.
Yeah.
They are twins.
But with Juwayni, so the imamate, it is really an indispensable means, but it is ultimately a means to an end. So if you cannot have the imamate, you can still have, religion and religious authority and the continuity of religion in some form. And this is what must be maintained at the fundamental level. And how do you maintain this? Either through, if they're available, mufti mujtahids and their authority. And that is extremely interesting, thinking about, if we want to sit down and think about how does the jurisdiction of Islamic law function in non-Muslim societies. And the one book I wanted to mention in this context is Catherine Miller's Guardians of Islam. So when Islam loses political authority, even before the fall of Granada in 1492, in Spain, she has an excellent discussion of what happens to the Muslim communities in places like Aragon. Effectively, the fuqaha are the leaders of Muslim civil society. They both represent Muslim society to the non-Muslim rulers, and they are kind of the leaders of Muslim society, and the kind of, they organize the community. And I know in Sohaira's very exciting second book, which I'm really excited about and looking forward to, on a completely different context, so as if her range wasn't impressive enough, on Islamic law in British India, from even before India's British, from the 17th century all the way into the 20th. And this is a context where, of course, thinking of the later 19th century in particular, Muslims are, disempowered politically, and they are a minority, right, politically and numerically.
Right. Just a quick recap. What did you say Catherine Miller's book was called?
I think Guardians of Islam. We will post the book title in the comments. So that's a really interesting. Now, where as Muslims in the UK or even in the United States or other minority contexts, or even because there are big Muslim communities, of course, in British India before partition, and
even
indeed
in context where, to a certain extent, much of the Muslim world, or much of the Arab world in particular, currently has rulers who do not really exemplify Islam, and sometimes may be considered to sort of, there's this big tension between Sisi and the Sheikh al-Azhar, because Sisi wants to bring in certain things which, for the Sheikh al-Azhar, is khariq al-ijma' or something along those lines.
Yes. But this point that it's
Muslims have found themselves in these circumstances. Obviously, there have been certain reactions which have been highly problematic to that reality, but Muslims are in a sense orphaned when it comes to the political sphere in general in the modern world.
Yes, and in particular thinking about Islamic law. I was discussing this with my students last week, and we'll discuss it throughout the semester. And Ruud Peter's book that we discussed in the previous week also has a brilliant article on this. Something like the place, and I'll also put the title if you like in the comments for the video. The fact that Islamic law in the great majority of its domains is not operative in the great majority of the Muslim majority world today. Outside of areas like family law, which has been subject to various kinds of reformulation and reform. And how do Muslims feel about this? Of course, you have a variety of perspectives. But let's say in late 19th century British India, early 20th century British India, that I know Sohaira will discuss in her exciting forthcoming book. I think of early scholars of Deoband, how do they advise their scholars to deal with the British court system outside areas like family law, where Islamic law does exercise a certain amount of influence? Should you go to a British judge to resolve your commercial disputes, bearing in mind his verdict will be based on British common law, not at all Islamic law, and so on. So it's these questions the book asks, notwithstanding the fact that some of these discussions, particularly epistemology and so on, are highly technically involved. And the book does speak to contemporary Muslims in a variety of ways, especially when it discusses politics in a broad sense.
But I mean, in a sense, it's even though it's this technically involved text, it's an opportunity.
And so some chapters more than others, of course.
Some chapters more than others. I mean, reading the introduction, I thought the style was, beautifully written, very elegant, very accessible.
Yes, I agree.
And, which is not something we can say for a lot of academic writing, of course. And so, in that sense, the intrepid lay reader should, I think, try to engage and grapple with the sections of the work that they would.
Well, I would say the entire book, actually, because. When you're discussing legal theory, you cannot avoid a certain amount of technicality. She always, flags the important, the take-home points, as it were, and always kind of makes very clear how this particular intervention, this particular domain of Juwayni's thought fits into this broad intellectual project. So you can always grasp at least the broad, even if you have no experience of legal theory. No, I think you can always grasp the kind of main points he's trying to make, even the more technical areas of the argument.
Of course, I mean, this is one of the advantages, arguably, of the way in which we write in the academy, compared to, for example, a lot of works in the classical tradition will assume a great deal of introductory, preparatory knowledge before you'd be able to access it. Whereas, Sohaira would be writing for potentially, non-Islamicists as well, who are interested in learning about that period of history.
Absolutely, and she does set the scene very nicely in each discussion, whether it's legal theory, and she talks about the background between Ash'ari and Mu'tazila, or it's the history, or there's a summary of political thought effectively before Juwayni, if you like, before she discusses Juwayni's politics.
Right. I should say, I mean, we have unfortunately just a short period of time left, around 8 minutes or so. It's a couple of someone's commented that they're really enjoying the discussion. Thank you very much, Ahmed Kali Khalifa. More broadly, if anyone has any particular questions they want to ask, please feel free to.
Or any comments, generally, please.
Or any comments. I'd also like to highlight, one thing which we've both been remiss about, myself and Omar, which is that there are some very brilliant female scholars out there who we have a huge amount to learn from, and I think people need to sort of spend a little more time. I'm speaking to myself first and foremost, recognizing that and reading those books. Right? So thank you, Omar, again for sort of taking the time to. This is, of course, an opportunity for me to.
I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount from this book. I mean, on a very basic level, the secondary sources I was totally unaware of, but just even at first contact, you can see how many hundreds of hours the author spent just looking at texts of legal theory. These are texts that and legal texts in legal theory in particular, they're often very knotty. You can't just read them and understand them. You have to sit down and untie the knots, and the amount of work that went into this book is intimidating, quite frankly.
But also, hopefully inspirational for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yes.
And Jaslam is adding, where was there a forthcoming? So he was just asking about what you described as the forthcoming book. I suppose it's not necessarily forthcoming. It's something which she's working on.
Well, it's been she's been writing it for some time, and the research obviously took years. She's a very thorough scholar. Right. Archives and all of this, and India and Britain, all kinds of research trips before COVID, of course. So it's a book on, if you like, Islamic law in South Asia. Right. Really beginning with, and I'm sure she talks about the field before. I don't know if there is a fixed title, or I'm not familiar with the provisional title. And if I find out, I can post it in the comments for the video on YouTube. But I didn't even know the relationship between the British and Islamic law goes back as far as the 17th century. Normally, it's kind of considered an 18th century thing at the very earliest. But going all the way from the 17th to the 20th centuries, Islamic law in South Asia, and in particular, how the kind of British reformed this. So there's much discussion of Anglo-Mohammedan law now. Law in the Mughal context is still very poorly understood. The spade work simply has not been done, and even in the British period, there is still a great deal to learn. So this will be an exciting book, and it will be required reading for many decades. I've absolutely no doubt. And based on what I've read in this book, it will impress us all a great deal, and I'm really excited about that book. And based on my excitement about this book.
Right. I apologize. Obviously, I'm doing this from home in COVID circumstances, and so I do have like a toddler in the house who might make some noise. But it adds much color to my life, alhamdulillah. So, I think we've discussed, a broad swath of the sort of the coverage of the book. It does have a good number of chapters. Those chapters are very sort of readable, but at the same time, in some cases quite pithy and quite a lot to sort of digest. I wonder if you can sort of maybe circle back to, so we've in a sense spoken about a certain degree of social and political history. We've discussed epistemology and legal theory. We've discussed briefly his politics of exceptional circumstances as well. Are there any aspects of the book that you think, any other aspects that you think are particularly sort of worth covering in the last 2-3 minutes of our session?
So where to start? She does touch on his legacy and the reception of Juwayni,
right,
particularly when exploring legal theory. So she talks about how subsequent Ash'ari Shafi'is, the Jumhur tradition of legal theory,
right,
how they felt about Juwayni's interventions in areas like Tawatur, in areas like Ijma', how they felt about this. And often, thinking particularly of Ijma', they weren't happy with his point that actually the scriptural evidences for this are quite weak and insufficient and inadequate in various ways. So,
but at the same time, what's interesting is, obviously that's going against Imam al-Shafi'i, who himself, the story of how he comes up with Ijma' is an interesting one, because he's invoking the, سبيل المؤمنين, the ayah talk about يتبع غير سبيل المؤمنين نوله ما تولى ونصله جهنم. I mean, it is a bit of a tenuous sort of, it is a bit of a, and the thing is, that's also recognized by people like, or arguably, I mean, I don't know the exact context in which Ahmed talks about man da'a al-ijma' faqad kadhab, which in the early period sometimes meant faqad akhta'a, so to speak, and according to
so this is discussed in the book.
Right. So I mean, so he's kind of drawing on a different, tradition to contest the Shafi'i position. It would seem he's not. This, I mean, one other aspect she kind of alludes to in the introduction, if I recall correctly, is that you have a standard understanding in the secondary literature now that the schools kind of form, and they are more or less accepted by the time you get to al-Juwayni, that will all operate within these schools.
Yes, but Shafi'is and Hanafis don't like each other much, even in this context.
No, not that there's concord,
but what's called the
that you have to kind of follow a madhab in a sense. And what would be interesting to me is Juwayni kind of bucks the trend a little on some of these masail at the end of the day, right? I mean, you're saying in his usul al-fiqh, at least, he's contesting the ijma'. As far as I recall, in his ilm al-kalam as well, like, he's not aligning himself with Ash'ari on everything, right? There are lots of contestation. So these are still very independent scholars working within traditions, as it were.
Absolutely. So she does talk about the impress of some particular kinds of Mu'tazili legal theory on his own. Of course, the Mu'tazila had the most sophisticated legal theory in the the 3rd and 4th centuries. Think of the Mu'tamad of al-Basri, Abu al-Hussein al-Basri specifically.
Abu Hussein al-Basri, sorry.
Not to be confused with Abi Abdullah al-Basri. Anyway, yes, now I should say he doesn't reject the authority of ijma'. He accepts the probativeness of these usul, but through a different means. Right. Through arguments for their authority, thinks that are more persuasive and less kind of tenuous. And I should say as well, something she acknowledges, she just doesn't have the space to discuss in the book, but has clearly thought about and reflected on a lot. al-Juwayni is important not just as a legal theorist, but as a faqih. His voluminous Nihayat al-Matlab fi Dirayat al-Madhab and Nihayat al-Sur is, Ghazali abridges it multiple times, and in some sense it is a kind of, and you could say Shafi'i's Kitab al-Umm is systematic, but it is truly systematic, fully coherent, systematized vision of Shafi'i law that is also deeply influential. And I know that she wanted to spend some time exploring how exactly the certainty, continuity, dialectic plays out in his furu', but there wasn't the space in which to do it.
This is a longish book already, as it were.
Yes, I mean, and very, very rich.
Right. We've come to the end of our hour. Jan Islam is just noting that Shawkani also objects to the use of that verse to justify the ijma'.
Yes, but Shawkani is a real a serious iconoclast who, doesn't pull his punches. And Ahmed Samsi has discussed him a lot in his book that we saw earlier in this series. But Juwayni is he does make departures from the Ash'ari Shafi'i legal theory and theological traditions.
Right.
But ultimately, in some sense, it's to produce new justifications for other positions, among other, interventions.
Right. Well, Jazakumullah khair, Omar. As I've mentioned, this is the sort of book, in terms of its richness and complexity, that would require a good deal, a lot longer to be able to do justice to.
Yes.
So, again, I guess we first thank Sohaira for writing a book like this.
Absolutely.
Which has really enriched, I think, the secondary literature and presented in many respects a challenge, an interdisciplinary challenge to all of us as we approach these sorts of subjects. And I'd like to thank you as well for taking the time to read this book twice, as I recall. And
it was a real pleasure, and I got a lot more out of it, with new readings, as is always the case.
Alhamdulillah. And I'd finally like to thank all the viewers who've tuned in. There have been many of you, and Jazakumullah khairan for sticking with us and inshallah benefiting from this session. And we will see you in a week's time. What's the book?
Yes.
Omar?
And next week we will be discussing, since we promised to atone for our sins of neglecting female authors, another fantastic book. This time I shall hold it up to the screen, by the fantastic Fawzia Bora, Writing History in the Medieval Islamic World, The Value of Chronicles as Archives, really focusing on the Fatimids and how the Fatimids were remembered through various archival and historiographical practices. So I very much look forward to that discussion.
Fawzia is, of course, a very dear friend and colleague of both of ours, including, as a Value Council member for BRACE, the British Association for Islamic Studies. And so we look forward to having that, inshallah, next week. And finally, Ahmed Khalid Khalifa very kindly saying thank you. Stumbled upon this podcast a few days ago and thoroughly enjoyed the episodes. Jazakumullah khairan for taking the time, and I hope this is something which is of value for both the field, but also for sort of the average Muslim who might be interested in these sorts of areas. I think there's a great deal to be had from looking at the work that's being produced in the academy right now, even though it's produced within a certain sort of social context that might be somewhat alien to the average Muslim lay sort of reader. But I think there can be sort of ways in which Muslims can really enrich their horizons by exploring the literature that's coming.
Yes, and my final point would be I'd like to hold up Sohaira and her scholarship and her book as exemplars of how this can be done.
Yes, yes. And thank you again, Omar, for this. And I hope we can all learn from Sohaira and inshallah next week, Fawzia, really how to sort of refine our scholarship. Jazakumullah khairan. And see you all next week, bi'idhnillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.